Hey guys! Tonight, we drift back to the marble-floored atriums of ancient Rome, where the wine flows, the walls whisper, and everyone knows someone who's committed adultery, sometimes legally, sometimes lethally. You're not just dozing off tonight, you're waking up as a Roman citizen beneath the sharp, anxious breath of empire. You're stretched out on a reclining couch, skin warm from the sunlight shafting in through the open ceiling. The air smells faintly of olive oil, beeswax, and something else, tension. Because in this world, even what happens in the bedroom isn't yours alone. Rome doesn't just govern your taxes and togas, it governs your kisses. See? There's a law. Roman law. If your wife cheats on you, well, that's shameful. But if you're her father and you catch her in the act, you're allowed to kill both her and her lover. Legally. Not metaphorically. Not emotionally. Literally. You could grab a knife, do the deed, and go home without being charged. And here's the twist. This law wasn't some leftover barbarian relic. It was signed, sealed, and publicized by the emperor himself, Augustus. That marble-faced master of morality decided that adultery was such a threat to Roman order, to Roman bloodlines, that it had to be criminalized. Not just socially condemned, made an actual, punishable offense. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me your location and local time. I love seeing how far we travel together each night. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. Hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stir beneath your linen sheets. The room around you is silent, but your thoughts are loud. You're in Rome, yes, but you're also in a world where the concept of honor is barbed. In fact, honor isn't just an idea, it's something that bleeds. Tonight's story begins not with a sword, but with a whisper. A daughter, married young, is suspected of misbehavior. Maybe it's love, maybe it's lust, or maybe it's politics. Doesn't matter. What matters is who catches her. If her husband walks in on the scene, well, he has some rights. He can beat up the guy, maybe take the case to court. But if her father walks in, that's where things shift. Because under Roman law, especially the Lex Julia de Adulterius, if you're a father and you catch your married daughter in flagrante delicto inside your own household, you're legally permitted to kill both her and the man she's with. No trial. No jury. Just swift, paternal vengeance. And you don't even get punished. Not officially. At least, we're not talking about some dark alley exception here. This is codified law. This is printed on bronze tablets and publicly displayed in the forum. This is Augustus's proud legacy, part morality campaign. Part population control. Part very personal trauma response to a society he thought was slipping into decadence. Historians still argue whether this law was Augustus's genuine attempt to preserve traditional Roman values, or just a convenient way to weaponize morality against political enemies. Either way, the impact was real and terrifying. Picture this. You're a young noblewoman, perhaps just 16, married off to secure your family's reputation. Your father still visits often, maybe even uninvited. One day, He arrives and finds you in bed with someone who isn't your husband. You scream. You beg? It doesn't matter. The law is on his side. He draws a blade. Now, here's the quirky bit. There were actual case scrolls detailing what kind of knife was appropriate short. Easily concealed. Not too dramatic. Too much blood would be distasteful. Because Romans were always balancing brutality with decorum. Even the location mattered. If the act happened under the father's own roof, his legal rights were stronger. If it was at someone else's house, less so. Location, like always, was real estate and power combined. And yes, these killings had to happen quickly, within 24 hours, or the father lost his legal cover. The law demanded a kind of swift justice, like it was trying to preserve not just the honor, but the immediacy of the rage. Hesitate. And suddenly, you had to go through the courts. No knife. Just scrolls and senators. You might think this law was rarely enforced. Nope. We have records. Some of them chilling. One father killed not just his daughter and her lover, but had the lover's body dragged through the street. Nude. As a warning. Did the courts condemn him? Not even a slap on the wrist. And yet here comes the irony if you as the husband caught them and you didn't act. You could be charged for failing to uphold public morality. That's right. The law saw your inaction as a problem. 2. So now, people were killing, not just out of passion, but out of obligation. Imagine living like that. Love becomes liability. Family becomes surveillance. Even the people meant to protect you like your father become the ones you fear most. You haven't moved much since the shock of it. That whole "your father can kill you if he catches you cheating" thing has kind of rearranged your mental furniture. And tonight, we're just getting started. Because before we even unsheath another dagger, you need to understand the emotional marinade. This all swims in Roman honor. See? Adultery wasn't just a private scandal. In Rome, it was a public sin. An affront to your gens, your family line, your ancestral name, the pride of your household gods. If someone insulted your honor by seducing your daughter, they weren't just violating her. They were violating your future grandsons. And in a society obsessed with lineage, that was the real horror. In fact, the Roman term pudicitia, female, modesty, or sexual virtue was considered almost sacred. The same way you might protect a national treasure, Roman men guarded their women's sexuality. Not because they cared deeply about their daughter's feelings. No, this was about control, about bloodlines, about inheritance. Imagine you're a Roman senator at dinner. Someone drops a joke about your son-in-law spending a little too much time away. Everyone laughs, but you freeze. Wine halfway to your lips. That's not just shade. That's social warfare. If people think your daughter is unfaithful, that rumor alone can tarnish your whole house. Historians still argue whether Roman adultery laws were created to protect women's virtue or to protect men's property rights over virtue. But in practice, the effect was the same. Women had little say in their desires, their marriages, or their safety. And now you know why this blood right belonged to fathers. Because in Roman thinking, a married daughter wasn't just a woman with a husband, she was a vessel still spiritually tethered to her father's authority. Even after marriage, she might sleep under her husband's roof, but her honor debt was still registered under dad's account. And if that account got overdrafted, well, guess who had the right to close it out? Notably, This power wasn't granted to mothers, not because they didn't care, but because legally, they didn't matter in this arena. Roman society was deeply patriarchal. Mothers nurtured. Yes, but they didn't have standing in matters of paterfamilias, the head of household power that made Roman men legal mini-kings in their homes. Even stranger, if a woman's mother did kill her adulterous daughter and her lover out of grief or rage, she'd go to trial. She could be exiled. Meanwhile, the dad, he could walk free. Maybe even be celebrated as a man of virtus, that ultimate Roman quality of strength. Discipline. And emotionally repressed violence? Now, here comes your quirky tidbit of the night. The Senate once debated whether a grandfather could inherit this lethal right if the father was deceased. The vote was tight. And eventually, nope. Only direct fathers got the license to kill. Grandpas had to stick to grumbling and shameful glances over olives. And let's not forget, this law wasn't just hanging around like a cobweb in some dusty legal corner. It was very publicly posted. Bronze tablets in the forum bore its words like commandments. People read this out loud to children. If your daughter is found in adultery, you may. Now, that's some heavy bedtime reading. But it wasn't all blunt force patriarchy. There was strategy. 2. A father could, for instance, pretend not to know, delay his arrival, give time for the couple to escape. He could choose not to kill. And yet, in doing so, he risked appearing weak, soft, unmanly. Because not killing when you legally could, that raised eyebrows. So even mercy had consequences. And don't get any Hollywood ideas about lovers running away. If you fled after being discovered in adultery, Roman law, let any male relative of the woman track you down for punishment. Fathers were the first tier, but brothers, uncles, even cousins could demand your prosecution. That's right. You weren't just in danger from one man, you were in danger from a clan. You sip your wine slower now? The room feels colder. You're starting to notice how many parts of this system were designed to trap. The architecture of Roman domesticity wasn't just about columns and courtyards, it was a legal maze. With honor as the bait, and blood as the consequence. Now here's something fringe, but it's documented there were cases where a father caught his daughter in adultery and only killed the lover, sparing her. And guess what? That was technically illegal. Because if you kill one, you're supposed to kill both. The law demanded symmetry. Which leads to this moment of dark comedy. There's a known legal case where a Roman father, after killing the man, turned to his daughter and said, "You owe your life to my grief," which is a very Roman way of saying, "Don't make me regret this." You're beginning to see the outlines of a culture that was both hyper-rational and violently emotional, sometimes in the same sentence. A world where the law wasn't just read, it was performed, and nowhere was the performance more tragic, more personal, than when it involved a father deciding whether to bury his daughter or forgive her. You haven't slept yet. Not really. Because now you're wondering, how did this get written down in the first place? Who was sitting in a marble-columned office and said, "You know what would help Rome's moral fabric? Legalizing murder if you catch your daughter cheating?" The answer, Augustus. Of course it was Augustus. The year is 18 BCE. You're in the twilight of the Roman Republic. But things don't feel very Republican anymore. Augustus, neither king nor dictator, officially has begun reshaping the empire with subtle but iron hands. Rome has just emerged from civil war. Morals are frayed. Families are fractured. Augustus sees a future crumbling from within. So he declares war, not on foreign enemies, but on immorality. That's where the Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coescendis comes in. One of several laws in his moral legislation bundle. It was designed to punish adultery, protect marriages, and promote childbirth among the elite. The Romans were running low on legitimate babies. You see? And Augustus had a plan: regulate the womb by regulating the bedroom. Under this law, adultery wasn't just scandalous, it was criminal. No longer just a dirty rumor. It now came with jail time, fines, and exile. And not just for women caught in the act, but for the men they slept with too, unless he was her husband. Then he had options: forgive, prosecute, or kill. You shift slightly, feeling the weight of legal parchment and patriarchy settle on your chest. But here's the kicker. This wasn't a fringe rule. Augustus wasn't operating in secret. He broadcasted this. His moral campaign included public speeches, Senate readings, and, yes, inscribed bronze plaques so that everyone knew the rules. It was like turning a legal sledgehammer into a bedtime lullaby. And guess who got to be the first big example? His own daughter, Julia. Yes, Julia the Elder. She was witty, beloved, and married off repeatedly to secure Augustus's political alliances. And despite her brilliance, or perhaps because of it, she didn't exactly comply with Dad's expectations of quiet. Virtuous womanhood. Rumors swirled. Affairs whispered. Eventually, Augustus invoked his own law and exiled her to a remote island. You'd think that would be enough, but it gets more uncomfortable. Historians still argue whether Augustus truly believed in this law as moral restoration, or whether it was more about tightening his grip on elite families and weakening rivals through their bedrooms. After all, controlling who sleeps with whom is a great way to destabilize alliances, especially in a city where gossip travels faster than the aqueducts flow. And let's talk about language, because Rome was always strategic with words. The law doesn't just say cheating. It uses terms like stuprum, sexual misconduct, and adulterium language, loaded with implications of female guilt and male shame. It doesn't just accuse it, brands. Now, here's your quirky moment. Some Roman elites began hiring private adultery investigators. That's right. You could pay someone to spy on your wife, track her movements, and catch her in the act, complete with witnesses, timed entries, and door-checking protocols. Like Sherlock Holmes meets tabloid Rome. And if she was caught, you had two options. Kill, if you're her father and it's within 24 hours. Or denounce her publicly, within 60 days. And if you didn't do either, you got charged as an accomplice. You, the injured party, became the criminal. Because this wasn't about healing marriages. This was about policing morality for the benefit of the state. And get this, the law allowed for rewards if you helped bring adulterers to justice. In one documented case, a neighbor snitched and got a percentage of the prosecuted lover's estate. So even your walls could have ears and motives. It's no surprise that, in this paranoid environment, some women began preemptively changing their wills, hiding their jewelry, or sending letters to friends with secret codes. One letter, preserved on wax tablets, says, if he finds the bracelet, say it was a gift from my cousin, which might be the ancient Roman version of clear my browser history. Now you're thinking, how did this affect men? Here comes the double standard, like a chariot crash. A married woman caught cheating was a criminal, but a married man caught visiting a brothel, perfectly legal. In fact, Roman law allowed husbands to sow their wild oats with slaves, concubines, and sex workers, as long as they didn't touch other citizens' wives or daughters. So, morality, it seems, had a passport and women were its customs agents. So when Augustus passed this law, did people cheer? Did they rise in the forum and say, "Hail to the Emperor of marital integrity"? Sort of, the Senate approved it. The elite played along. But graffiti told another story. Found etched into a wall near Pompeii. She may be married, but she's still mine on Tuesdays. Subtle rebellion. Roman style. Now picture this. You're a Roman woman, married off at 15, watching every gaze you return, every step you take, every letter you send. The law isn't protecting you. It's circling you like a legal collar. And above it all stands Augustus, stoic, statuesque, and determined to rebuild Rome's morals, one ruined affair at a time. You'd think, after all that laws, exile, surveillance, and public shame, Rome would at least require some kind of hard evidence before letting someone commit legal murder. But you'd be wrong, because under the Lex Julia, if a father caught his married daughter in the act of adultery, he didn't need a lawyer, a jury, or even a solid alibi. He just needed to catch them red-handed literally in the moment. This wasn't trial by evidence. It was trial by walk-in. So here's the scene. You're an aging Roman patrician with an elegant beard and a personal slave named Pinna who always overcooks the fish. You come home early, sandals clicking across your mosaic floor. The door to your daughter's room is ajar. Laughter, a shuffle of bedsheets, and boom, there they are. At this precise moment, your legal rights light up like a divine scroll. If you act now, within the hour, the law says you can kill both of them on the spot. But if you wait even a few hours, if you stop to eat lunch, take a nap, or, heaven forbid, hesitate out of emotional confusion, you've lost your chance. Historians still argue whether this 24-hour rule was meant to prevent premeditated murder or simply preserve the idea of a heat-of-the-moment reaction. But either way, the implication is clear. Vengeance is only noble if it's fast. And there's another catch, because of course there is. You can only claim this lethal privilege if the adultery happens under your daughter's roof. If she's cheating in a country villa or on some seaside getaway in Ostia, no knife for you. The law says in domo mariti, meaning the marital home. The implication adultery is only a family shame if it happens in public sight, in the literal heart of domestic honor. So now you're doing mental cartography. Where was the act? Who owns the house? What counts as under her roof? If she's technically living in her husband's cousin's guest bedroom for the week, that's where legal loopholes start slithering in. Because Roman law, while sharp, was also slippery. Lawyers, jurisprudentes made whole careers out of finding ways to twist space, time, and intention into technical defenses. One famous case involved a father who claimed his daughter intended to return to her marital home that night, and therefore her spirit had technically returned there already. He killed her lover in a different house and won. You lie there blinking, This is starting to feel less like law and more like improv theater. But with real swords. And what about the actual killing? Did they just do it? No ceremony? No. Aftermath. Oh? No? There was absolutely a protocol. The father had to act with temperance. That is, he couldn't mutilate the body. No theatrics. No, tossing the body into the Tiber in a fit of rage, he was expected to kill cleanly. If he failed to maintain this weird balance of wrath and dignity, the courts could still charge him with excessive cruelty. Imagine that your law allows you to kill, but asks that you do it tastefully. Like it's murder, with etiquette. And now, here's your quirky tidbit. In some elite families, they actually rehearse these legal scenarios. Think about that. You're 10 years old, sitting at the family dinner table, and your father is explaining, "If one day I find you in a shameful embrace, daughter, I will not hesitate, but only in this house, within the hour, clean cut. Sleep well. Kids? But you know what's even darker? The lovers had no right to defend themselves. If caught mid-act, even screaming. It's not what it looks like wouldn't help. There was no legal hearing for the man. No chance to say he didn't know she was married, or that it was mutual, or even that they were secretly married. Maybe in a weird foreign rite. Didn't matter. If the father caught them, the man was legally dead. You might be wondering now what happened to the bodies. Well, if the father killed them, he was expected to report the act to local officials within a set time. He had to show he did it under the law, not just out of vengeance. That meant producing the bodies. Ideally, unspoiled. For inspection, like a morbid version of show your work on a math test. If he failed to report, or tried to hide the crime, then it became murder. And this wasn't a minor distinction. Roman courts could make or break an entire family's social status over whether a killing followed the letter of the law. But if done properly, no penalty, no exile, maybe even praise. Because the father had defended pudicitia, the sacred modesty of Roman women, his family name was, in theory, purified. And that's the word you'll hear again and again, purity. Romans didn't talk about adultery as betrayal. They talked about it as pollution, like something that had to be cleansed with fire or steel. You turn your head on the pillow, half expecting to hear footsteps on mosaic tiles behind you. Because that's the real nightmare here, not the stabbing. Not even the law. It's the chilling. Ritual logic that turns honor killings into civic duty. The air hangs heavy tonight. Like the pause before someone draws a curtain or a blade. You know the father can kill, but what about you? The husband. It turns out that being married in ancient Rome didn't grant you all the rights you might expect. In fact, in the realm of adultery law, you're second fiddle to her father. Imagine that you marry a woman, share a home, pay her dowry, eat dinner at the same triclinium table, and then, if she's caught cheating, her dad gets first blood. So, how does this legal hierarchy work? If both the husband and the father catch the adulterous act together, the father has priority. He may kill, you may not. You can stand there holding your toga awkwardly, while the man who once gave her away at the wedding prepares to strike, and if the father isn't present, or doesn't act within his window of 24 hours, only then does the right pass to you, the husband. But here's the catch. You cannot kill both lovers. You're only legally allowed to kill the male lover, and only under very specific conditions. And now we enter one of Rome's strangest legal paradoxes, the kill one but not both clause. Let's break it down like a grim little checklist. Were you married to her legally? Was the act of adultery committed in your home? Was the male lover a low-status person, a freedman, actor, or prostitute? Great. Senator problem. Did you act within the time limit? Tick all the boxes. And congratulations, you may now murder one person. No, more. No less. Any deviation, and you're the criminal. Historians still argue whether this was Rome's attempt at restraining honor killings, or just another layer of social control disguised as moral order. Either way, it left the husband in a strange spot, expected to punish. But not over-punish. Now here's your quirky tidbit: if the husband killed both the wife and the lover, he could be charged with excessive vengeance, which is not only darkly ironic, but also uniquely Roman. You can be condemned, not for the murder itself, but for doing it too enthusiastically. And there's more. Let's say you choose not to kill. You're a forgiving type. You want to talk things through. Maybe take up journaling. Well, tough luck. Because by not killing or denouncing your adulterous wife within 60 days, you become culpable. The law assumes you're complicit. That's right. You're either judge, jury, and executioner, or you're a criminal. There's no cozy middle ground. The law demands performance. If your wife cheats, you must react or Rome reacts to you. Let's say you want to play it safe. You report the affair instead of swinging a blade. Even then, it's not over. You have to initiate a formal accusation before a magistrate, provide witnesses, sign statements, possibly appear in court. Oh, and your wife, she gets exiled. That's the standard penalty: forced relocation to some miserable island. Usually without servants, comfort, or visibility. And the man he's exiled to. Sometimes farther. Sometimes to barren coasts or rocky outposts that feel more like punishment than geography. But what if he's a citizen of higher rank than you? Someone important? Then your accusation gets complicated because political connections can shield someone from exile or even investigation. This is where Rome's famous legal double standard sharpens into something deadly. You can be legally right and still lose in practice. Powerful men often dodged conviction with favors, bribes, or simply better connections. And if they got off easy, you looked like a fool, unable to protect your honor or your marriage. Sans response. Many husbands, especially poorer ones, resorted to violence. Not out of bloodlust, but out of desperation. A public stabbing was often more effective at defending reputation than a legal process that favored the elite, and sometimes the law let it slide. As long as you followed the choreography: one death, under your roof, clean strike, it was fine. Let's not forget reputation was everything. In a society built on status, rumors had weight. Gossip could destroy your social capital faster than a missed Senate vote. That's why the law forced husbands into action. If you let your wife get away with it, you looked weak. If you acted too late, you looked suspicious. If you killed improperly, you looked bloodthirsty. It was a legal tightrope, and one with very real consequences. And here's the worst part: even after all that, even after doing everything right, you didn't get your wife back. Once denounced, she was barred from returning to you. Permanently. The law treated adultery like a virus. You couldn't take her back. Even if you forgave her. Even if she begged. Even if she was pregnant with your child. You weren't just expected to punish her. You were forbidden from reconciling. And this, in many ways, reveals the cold heart of the law. It wasn't about healing. It wasn't about family. It was about removing impurity from the social fabric. About burning out the infection before it spread. You lie back now. Silent. Maybe you're starting to see why Roman husbands didn't sleep well. Not because of betrayal, but because of the weight of expectation. You weren't allowed to feel. You were only allowed to act. You're still awake because the deeper we go, the more twisted this gets. We've talked about fathers and husbands, but tonight, let's tilt the candelabrum toward an uncomfortable question: why only fathers, not mothers, get the legal right to kill? The answer is not just about law, it's about Roman identity itself. In Rome, the household was ruled by the paterfamilias, the eldest male ancestor still alive. He wasn't just the dad. He was, legally speaking, a walking institution. He could arrange marriages, approve adoptions, sell children into slavery, and, yes, in certain cases, even kill a family member without trial. His authority, patria potestas, was the legal equivalent of having the gods on speed dial. So when Augustus penned the adultery laws, he didn't invent the idea of male control. He simply added a fresh, marble-polished coat of legality to a cultural foundation that was already soaked in it. Mothers, they weren't seen as legal heads of the family. They were expected to manage the household, educate children, mourn the dead, spin wool, and stay quiet. Important work. Sure, but no swords in sight. Even wealthy, powerful, Roman, matrons like Livia, Augustus's own wife, had to operate behind veils and within whispers. Historians still argue whether women in Rome had informal power through influence and patronage, or whether the whole powerful Roman woman idea is a modern projection. But legally, the line was clear. Fathers acted, mothers watched. So, what if a mother did catch her daughter in adultery? Well, she could scream. She could faint. She could make threats. But the law didn't empower her to do anything. If she acted on impulse, say, stabbed the lover or slapped her daughter, she could be charged with assault or murder. No exceptions. No special rights. Here's a quirky moment in one preserved court record. A mother reportedly tried to smother her daughter's lover with a tapestry. The case was thrown out, but not before the Senate spent 3 hours debating whether home decor counted as a lethal weapon. You laugh, but it's a bitter one. The law didn't just silence women, it immobilized them. And that had ripple effects. A Roman mother could see her daughter married off at 14. No, the girl was miserable. Suspect the husband was unfaithful, and still have no say. But if that same daughter cheated, the mother watched the father take up the knife, the message was clear, even in private matters. Roman women were expected to be objects of morality, not agents of justice. And don't think this power imbalance was limited to the rich. In lower-class Roman families, especially among the freedmen and tradespeople, cultural expectations still mirrored elite values. Fathers held the disciplined stick. Mothers held the crying towel. Even religious life reflected this dynamic. Male priests presided over most public rites. Female priesteses, like the famous Vestal Virgins, gained prestige only by renouncing sex entirely. Their value came from symbolic purity, not agency. Now, imagine being a Roman girl watching all this. You grow up hearing lullabies about Lucretia, the woman who killed herself after being raped, not because she had done wrong, but because her honor was damaged. You're taught that a woman's virtue is a family's honor, that your body is your father's reputation. You know you don't own your story. You're just living in a chapter someone else will edit or erase. Still with me? Let's zoom in on one documented case that shows just how firmly the door was shut on maternal action. A noblewoman named Domitia once tried to shield her daughter from prosecution after an adultery charge. She pleaded with the court, claimed her daughter had been misled, intoxicated, seduced by deceit. The judges nodded, and then they fined Domitia for interfering with legal judgment. The father remained silent and was praised for his dignified restraint. The cruelty wasn't in the punishment. It was in the structure, in the assumption that female voices, even when filled with truth or grief, were background noise in the symphony of Roman law. And here's a bitter irony. The Lex Julia itself, this sword of Justice Augustus waved like a moral lightning bolt, was named after a woman, Julia. His daughter, she became the symbol of the law, the scapegoat, the cautionary tale, and she never got to speak in her own defense. You shift under your covers. I'm aware now of how one-sided the system was. Men wrote the laws, enforced the laws, interpreted the laws, and used them as tools not only of morality, but of domination. Not just over women, but over other men too. Because when you can decide who gets to kill, you also decide who gets to win. You're starting to feel the weight of it now, not just the sharpness of Roman law, but its timing. Because here's something truly wild. Even if the father had the right to kill, he could only do it within a strict time limit. Not just eventually, not when the court date clears. No. The Lex Julia said he had to act fast. Specifically, within 24 hours of discovering the affair. Let that sink in. The law gave you just one day, one Roman day, to decide whether or not you were going to commit homicide, legally. And it's not even just the discovery of the affair. It's the act itself. You had to catch them in the act. Then, and only then, start the 24-hour countdown. Which means, for the father, that moment of discovery was also a moral timer. From the second the bedsheets ruffled and the candles flared, he had 86, 400 seconds to act. If he hesitated, no second chances. After that, killing was murder again. No more honor. Just homicide. Historians still argue whether this 24-hour window was Augustus trying to limit bloodshed, or whether it was designed to encourage swift moral correction. Either way, it had brutal clarity. Act quickly, or lose your right forever. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. There's evidence that some Roman fathers carried daggers on their person, just in case. You know, like, better to be prepared, in case she's being unchaste behind the atrium. Not exactly the warmest parenting strategy, but welcome to Rome. The pressure wasn't just legal, it was social. If word got out that you caught your daughter in the act but didn't kill her lover, people started asking questions. Has he gone soft? Is he ashamed? Maybe he approved of the affair. In a world where gossip was a weapon sharper than steel, failing to act could mean becoming suspect yourself. So, what if the father wanted to act but physically couldn't. Maybe he was old. Maybe there were guards. Maybe he passed out from shock. Didn't matter. The law didn't allow for excuses. You didn't act in time. Too bad. The moment passed, and this created a culture of performative rage. Fathers were expected to lash out. A softer word, a tearful confrontation. Those didn't look Roman enough. It had to be decisive, brutal, controlled, but not too controlled. The ideal Roman father walked a tightrope between stoic justice and righteous wrath. Let's imagine a scenario. You're a well-off Roman father in your 60s. You walk into your daughter's room, and there he is, a young poet with perfect curls and a smug grin. You freeze. He panics. She gasps. And you realize you could kill them? But here's the dilemma. Do you act now? Or wait to think it over? If you wait, you lose the legal shield. If you act, your hands will be stained, but your reputation clean. The clock ticks. 1 hour. 2. You glance at the sundial in your courtyard and feel your pulse sinking with its shadow. What kind of civilization does this to its people, Rome? That's what kind. Now, here's another twist. If you caught them but delayed killing by even a few hours, say, you locked them in a room while you consulted a priest or got some advice you could lose your right. Why? Because the law only applied if the act of violence followed immediately after discovery. Hesitation was considered post facto anger, aka revenge, not honor. This led to all kinds of bizarre legal acrobatics. Some fathers reportedly shouted down corridors while running, "I am still within my rights," as if the law might expire mid-sprint. And the implications weren't just limited to that day. Once the 24-hour window closed, the father could no longer personally punish, but was now required to bring charges. He had to go to a magistrate. File a case. Name witnesses, and basically say I didn't kill them. So now I'm suing them. You know what that looks like in Roman society weakness? You had the chance. You didn't take it? Now you're in scrolls and sandals. Doing paperwork. Not exactly heroic. But what about the woman, the daughter? What was her experience during those ticking 24 hours? Well, it was hell. Because if her father caught her, she knew exactly what the law allowed. There are preserved letters frantic. Shaky scripts from women who begged friends to hide them, to take them into temples, even to shave their heads and pass as slaves just to escape a vengeful father during the time window. You can imagine her breathing shallow, panicked, waiting to see if her father returns with a knife or with silence. And even if she survived, even if he didn't act, her punishment wasn't over. Because after 24 hours, she could still be formally accused, still be exiled, still lose everything. The only difference, she might live, in a way. The time limit was less about law and more about ritual. The state gave the father his hour of sacrifice, as some historians call it, a sacred window to cleanse the family name through blood. After that, justice became bureaucratic. Dry, cold, less satisfying. Perhaps, for a man taught since birth that honor should be avenged with action. You roll over, facing the wall now, not because it's safer, but because you don't want to imagine what happened when a man wanted to kill, but got to the scene a moment too late. What burned more, the shame of restraint, or the regret of not being quick enough? Either way, the clock won. You lie still now, but your thoughts are racing. You've heard of crimes of passion, but Rome turned them into crimes of architecture. Because here's the twist that makes everything more maddening. The father could only kill the lovers if the act happened in his daughter's home. Not in a garden. Not in a villa by the coast. Not even at an inn. No. It had to be under her roof. This might sound oddly specific, like one of those legal details a modern lawyer would mutter while adjusting their glasses, but in ancient Rome, space mattered. The house wasn't just a shelter. It was the moral stage. The idea was simple. Adultery committed in the home meant an insult to the entire household, to the sacred hearth, to the ancestors whose masks lined the walls. Let's say your daughter snuck off to a neighbor's bathhouse or slipped into a small temple courtyard for her rendezvous. You find out. Come running. Sword in hand. Too bad. The law doesn't cover it. You kill the man. You're now on trial. No honor defense. No Lex Julius shield. But if you walk in on her inside her cubiculum, her sleeping chamber, and she's tangled in the arms of a young flute player, that's your cue. You can act immediately. No paperwork required. Historians still debate why Augustus insisted on this spatial restriction. Some say it was a way to control vigilante killings, force people to act only within familiar walls. Others argue it was about symbolism. The Roman domus was a holy place, and violations within its walls were more than personal. They were spiritual. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's an actual Roman case where a father caught his daughter in a field outside the city and dragged her and her lover into her house before killing them just to stay within the law. The court let it slide. Now picture that for a moment. You're literally hauling two half-dressed lovers down a gravel road like some kind of toga-clad morality Sherpa, yelling. This will be legal in 10 minutes. And you thought HOA rules were bad? Let's complicate it further. What is her home? If she's married, it's technically her husband's house. But if she's visiting her father's estate or staying at a cousin's domus during a festival, what counts legal scholars in Rome? Being Roman. Had an answer. Domus Mariti? The husband's house was the primary site. So unless the adultery happened there, the law gets murky. If the act took place somewhere else, the killing was no longer automatically protected. At best, you might argue, diminished responsibility. At worst, it's back to court, with a murder charge staring you down. And just imagine the mental gymnastics this required. Fathers didn't just have to catch the act, they had to do it on location. The ancient Roman version of, if it doesn't happen in your jurisdiction, hands off. This had another effect. It made Roman houses into traps. Beautiful ones, tiled and perfumed, but traps nonetheless. The atrium became a courtroom, the tablinum a corridor to death. The triclinium where you dined might be your last supper. Even the door slaves ostiari were drawn into the drama. If a servant witnessed the act and didn't report it, he could be punished for conspiring in adultery, which led to cases where fathers installed informants, basically security cams with sandals around the house just to monitor their daughter's behavior. It gets worse. Let's say you're a daughter, accused, but innocent. Maybe it was just a conversation. Maybe the man was delivering a letter. Maybe you tripped. If it happened in your room and your father walked in, doesn't matter. The setting alone could trigger a death sentence. That's the power of space in Roman law. The room testified against you. This spatial obsession bled into Roman literature too. Poets like Ovid and Propertius wrote sly verses about lovers sneaking through porticos, slipping past dozing guards, Reaching the forbidden bedroom. Always the bedroom. Because even in fiction, that's where the real danger lay. Not in the feeling. Not in the kiss. But in where it happened. And now you're starting to see it. The Lex Julia wasn't just a moral code. It was interior design with consequences. How you built your house, where you placed your daughter's room. How accessible it was. Who was allowed in could determine life and death. You might think surely there were exceptions occasionally. Yes. If a daughter was found in the act somewhere public, like a bathhouse or theater, and the father acted impulsively, sometimes the courts showed leniency. But the default answer was no. The act must occur in the domestic sphere to count as family betrayal, rather than mere indiscretion. And this creates a chilling thought. What if a father waited for his daughter to return home just to have the legal right to kill her, because Roman law had little patience for gray zones? It didn't care about motive. It didn't care about mercy. It only cared about form, procedure, and place. So as you lie there now, staring at the wooden beams above your bed, you can't help but imagine them overhead in a Roman house, silent witnesses to countless moments of love, betrayal, and violence. How many stories ended not because of what someone did, but because of where they did it? You're starting to feel it now. The way Roman law doesn't just punish actions, it obsesses over the details. And once you understand how time and space shape these laws, it's time to ask, how did people manipulate them? Because of course they did. This is Rome. The same place where politicians bribed augurs to read favorable omens and men wore togas that said, "I'm humble," while orchestrating 10 coups before lunch. So tonight, you're slipping into a shadowy part of Roman justice, the legal loopholes and dark corners. Let's start with the basics. The Lex Julia was clear. If you caught your daughter in the act of adultery, in her home, and within 24 hours, you could kill both her and the lover. But what if you suspected her, but didn't quite catch her? Simple, you set a trap. There are actual documented cases of fathers staging fake trips to give their daughters a chance to let down their guard. One particularly conniving senator reportedly left Rome on business, only to sneak back into the city that night, hide behind a curtain, and leap out mid-act like a toga-clad banshee. The case was deemed legal. The lovers died. It sounds cartoonish, but this was the reality. Once the law existed, people began choreographing their wrath. It became theater. A moral spectacle. And here's where it gets darker sometimes. People faked the crime entirely. Let's say you wanted to get rid of your daughter-in-law, or your political rival's son. Accuse them of adultery. Claim you caught them. Produce a few loyal slaves to testify. Boom. Instant. Légale exécution. Historians still argue whether these forged adultery claims were common or rare, but a handful of preserved court scrolls suggest it happened, especially when land, titles, or revenge were involved. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. One Roman case included a lover already dead before the act was supposedly discovered. The father dragged the corpse into his daughter's room, staged the scene, and claimed a posthumous adultery. The court didn't buy it, but still, he almost got away with it. You can't make this stuff up, but the Romans could. Then there's the timing trick. As we know, you had a 24-hour window. Some men exploited this by claiming the discovery happened later than it actually did. Maybe it was 2 a.m., but they said it was 7. No sundials in the courtroom. After all, Others kept the bodies hidden until they could build a story, then uncovered them in a legally appropriate way. It was grim. It was calculated. And it was oddly common. This created an entire sub-industry of Roman life, the legal witness. If you were planning to catch an adulterer, you needed people who would testify reliably. Preferably, your own slaves or freedmen. Maybe a loyal client or two. Their job, to confirm your version of events. Yes. My lord walked in and found them entangled. Yes. It was within the legal time frame. Yes. The bedroom was technically inside the domus. These people were your ticket to legal immunity. And if you were the accused, you could hire witnesses too. People who'd claim the room wasn't hers. Or that the man was just delivering olive oil. Or that it was a dream sequence. Yes. Seriously. One preserved defense scroll from the city of Capua includes a man arguing that what the father saw was a mirage of Venus sent to test his resolve. The judge rolled his eyes. The man was exiled. But hey, A for creativity. Here's where the manipulation gets even more subtle, because even if you didn't want to kill anyone, you could still use the accusation of adultery as a weapon. Accuse your daughter. Don't press charges. Just let the gossip bloom. Her marriage collapses. Her reputation shrivels. The lover disappears. Political alliances fall apart. And you, the puppeteer, never even lifted a blade. In this way, the law became less about justice and more about leverage. People whispered adultery accusations in Senate halls to ruin careers. They dangled them over family feasts. One noblewoman was forced into a second marriage just because her ex-father-in-law hinted that she'd been unfaithful without evidence. You're seeing it now. Right. The Lex Julia wasn't just about sexual morality. It was about control. It gave fathers and husbands state-sanctioned methods to police bodies, enforce alliances, or destroy enemies. And like any powerful system, it spawned a dark mirror. Lies, setups, entrapments. Let's not forget the legal advisors, those silver-tongued jurisconsults who spent hours crafting arguments about whether a door counted as open or whether a second-floor room qualified as within the domus. These guys were the original loophole artists. Give them an hour and a denarius, and they could turn almost any crime into a noble misunderstanding. And Rome let it happen, because deep down, the law wasn't about clarity. It was about spectacle. Adultery trials were public events. Crowds gathered. Senators whispered. Morality became performance. You pull the blanket a little higher now. The air feels colder. It's not just that Rome allowed people to manipulate the system, it's that Rome expected it. Wrote the laws to be twisty. Left the doors half open. Let justice become something you could rehearse. And you wonder, in a world like that, what was scarier, the crime itself, or the choreography of pretending to stop it? By now, your eyes are heavy, but your mind is wide awake. Because you've heard what happens when a father acts quickly. When he catches the lovers, when he kills them and walks away clean. But what if he doesn't kill anyone? What happens then? Well, the answer is he becomes responsible in a whole new way. Because under the Lex Julia, inaction wasn't noble. It was criminal. Let's say you're the husband. You come home. You hear a noise in the bedroom. You see the sandal prints on the mosaic floor. You find the lover, maybe even exchange a few awkward words. But instead of drawing your dagger, you hesitate. Maybe you're tired. Maybe you're confused. Maybe you just really hate paperwork. And so you do nothing. You say nothing. Bad move. Because now the clock starts ticking not on your right to kill, but on your obligation to report. Under the Lex Julia. Once you discovered your wife's adultery and chose not to kill, or weren't legally allowed to, you had exactly 60 days to denounce her publicly. That meant going to a praetor, a kind of Roman magistrate, and filing formal charges. You'd need witnesses, statements, and possibly a small parade of embarrassed slaves to describe what they saw. Fail to do this, then you, the husband, become an accomplice. And Rome didn't look kindly on accomplices. Historians still argue whether this clause was Augustus's way of pushing men to take morality seriously, or just a clever way to ensure adultery cases didn't rot in silence. Either way, the effect was chilling. Your silence was interpreted as consent. And here's your quirky tidbit in one famous case. A husband was charged not just with failure to report, but with moral cowardice. The judge said, if he lacks the courage to defend his bed, he has no right to it. The man was fined, mocked, and rumor has it forced to sleep in the garden for a year. So what exactly did this 60-day reporting process look like? Well, you went to the magistrate, explained what you witnessed, named your wife and her lover, and submitted your evidence. You were expected to be precise. Not just she was unfaithful, but how, where, when, and with whom. Romans loved paperwork almost as much as they loved vengeance. If your claim passed the initial test, your wife was summoned. She could defend herself, say she was framed, coerced, or it was just a misunderstanding. The lover, too, had his say. Witnesses were called. It was dramatic, public, often scandalous. But if you didn't show up within 60 days, or if you tried to keep it quiet, then the law turned its blade on you. You could be charged with pimping, yes? Lenocinium. In Roman terms, the idea was that by not reporting, you were profiting by silence. That maybe you'd been bribed. That maybe you allowed the affair to continue for some hidden gain. And let's say you did report it, but you were sloppy, forgot to bring a witness, misspoke a name, got the timing wrong. The case could collapse, and you'd be left looking like a petty, jealous husband? Reputation ruined. Justice denied. Dignity slipped out the atrium with the laundry. And here's where it really hurt. Once you made the accusation, you could never take it back. You couldn't say, actually, I forgave her. Nope. The law didn't care if love bloomed anew. Once denounced, the marriage was legally and permanently severed. If you tried to take her back, you would be prosecuted for violating moral order, which led to all kinds of heartbreak. There are surviving letters from Roman men pleading with officials, she is the mother of my children, and I cannot bear to see her exiled. But the courts were unmoved. Augustus had designed a moral machine that did not reverse. This rigidity created an atmosphere of cold calculation. Men had to ask themselves, do I love her, or do I love not being punished? And don't think women were passive in this. Some wives caught wind of their husbands discovering the affair and raced to the magistrate, first accusing them of neglect. Cruelty. Or worse, if they filed first, they could preemptively tilt the court's opinion. It became a race to the scrolls. In wealthier families, this became a strategy. Lawyers were kept on retainer. Slaves were trained to carry witness statements. People rehearsed their testimony like lines in a play. Because in Rome, the bedroom was just another stage in justice. Just another performance. Now, let's say you're a nobleman, and your wife is caught. You choose not to kill. You report her. She's convicted. Justice is served. Right? Sort of. Because now you are barred from marrying another woman of equal class. Why? Because it was believed that men who had failed in their first marriage didn't deserve a second chance among the elite. So the law punished you again quietly. Socially, but unmistakably. And what about the woman exile? Not always harsh, but always humiliating. A villa on a windswept island. No guests. No letters. Sometimes no jewelry. For the rest of her life. She was branded not just unfaithful, but morally contagious. Rome didn't exile you to forget you. It exiled you to make sure everyone remembered you lie there now. Understanding that the Lex Julia didn't just create a rule book, it created a moral battlefield. Where silence was treason. Where forgiveness was forbidden. Where love, once broken, could never be repaired. And worst of all, where being merciful made you the villain, the long shadow of the Lex Julia stretched far beyond the elite villas and Senate chambers. It seeped into the daily lives of ordinary Romans, shaping their fears and behaviors in subtle yet profound ways. In bustling neighborhoods, where slaves, freedmen, artisans, and merchants jostled in crowded streets, the law was both distant and omnipresent. Official enforcement might be rare, but social pressure was constant. Neighbors whispered, eyes darted, tongues wagged, accusations, whether grounded or fabricated, could ruin a person's reputation overnight. Families monitored each other with a vigilant gaze. Mothers warned daughters to guard their modesty. Fathers kept wary watch over sons' ambitions. And husbands. They were expected to maintain order. Even if that meant suspicion and jealousy ruled the household, historians still debate how rigorously the Lex Julia applied to the lower classes. Some argue it was largely symbolic for the poor, while others point to local magistrates using it to assert authority and maintain public morality. In any case, the law's ideals penetrated even the poorest homes, creating a culture of surveillance and restraint. You imagine a crowded apartment in the Sabura district, where a wife's late-night absence sparks rumors, and a husband's silence only fuels suspicion. The law may not have been enforced with a sword in every street, but its weight was felt in every cautious glance and hushed conversation. And so, the Lex Julia was not just a law of Rome's rulers, it was a law that touched every corner of the empire, shaping lives with invisible chains. The candle flickers low now, but the question still glows sharp. How did they prove any of this? In a world without photos, fingerprints, or camera traps, what counted as evidence in an adultery case? You might think surely someone would need solid proof. A smoking tunic, a letter, a moan behind a curtain. But no. Welcome to ancient Rome, where locked doors, footprints, and witness testimony were the bedrock of one of the most emotionally explosive charges in the entire legal system. Let's start with the most basic requirement, a witness. under the Lex Julia. An accusation of adultery couldn't proceed without at least one witness, and preferably more. You couldn't just say, "I have a feeling." You had to show up with someone who saw it happen, and not just saw the couple together. They had to observe obvious sexual intimacy. Whatever that meant. Historians still debate what counted. Some courts accepted a couple being alone behind a closed door. Others demanded partial nudity. One overly dramatic judge insisted on the sound of rustled bedclothes, which might be the most passive-aggressive legal phrase ever uttered. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. Some households kept witness niches, little alcoves near bedrooms, where trusted slaves could eavesdrop or peek in just in case. Imagine hiring interior decorators to help you spy on your daughter's marriage. Very Roman. Very creepy. If witnesses weren't available, prosecutors leaned on circumstantial evidence. That meant things like locked doors and drawn curtains, 2 wine cups in a room for one, a robe left behind, a flushed face and tousled hair, one man hiding in a laundry basket. Yes. Really. Pompeii graffiti confirms it. And if you think this sounds like a teenage sitcom, rest assured, it led to outcomes more grim than comedic. One man, caught half-dressed in a senator's house, argued he'd just fallen asleep reading poetry. The judge replied, "Then, let the gods punish poets who write such dangerous verses." He was exiled. Another common tactic. Interrogating slaves. That's right. Your own household servants could be brought in to testify, though not without restrictions. Roman law technically barred the use of slave testimony against their own masters, unless extracted under torture. Yes, torture. It was called quaestio, and it was standard practice. So if you were the husband, and you suspected adultery, you could drag your wife's handmaid to court, have her strapped to a chair, and ask questions while someone applied heat or lashes until she confessed. That's how you got the truth in Rome, not by reasoning, but by wringing it out. But even torture came with rules. You had to apply to a magistrate for permission. You had to argue your case. And if you tortured a slave without proper authority, you became the criminal. Some men tried to bend this rule by renting other people's slaves for questioning. There's a hilarious and horrifying record of a man hiring out his neighbor's cook so he could legally beat information out of her about an affair she had no part in. Then there were the letters, love notes, poems. Even shopping lists became critical exhibits in court. One case hinged on a letter that read, "I long for you under the stars, though I must pass through 3 atria to reach your chamber." The defense argued it was metaphor. The prosecution brought in an architect to prove the house had exactly 3 atria. The man lost. Even gifts became suspicious. Jewelry, perfume, a new pair of sandals, unless your wife had a rich aunt. The court wanted to know who was paying. Adultery was often a trail of favors, one necklace at a time. Now imagine the woman, accused, terrified, standing in court while strangers read her private letters aloud. Inspect her tunic. Question her slaves. She can't speak unless a male guardian permits her. And if she breaks down or stays silent, both could be interpreted as guilt. It wasn't just legal. It was spectacle. Crowds gathered for adultery trials. The gossip fed Rome's rumor mills for months. And for the elite, reputation didn't just matter. It was currency, which meant that sometimes false accusations were planted to ruin political rivals. You didn't need truth, just a convincing performance. One case involved a senator whose enemies bribed a servant to to claim he'd seen improper behavior between the senator's wife and a young officer. The senator sued for defamation and lost. Why? Because the officer was seen leaving the senator's house with unbuttoned sandals. That's how thin the line was. And when the system failed, when evidence was murky, or the witnesses contradicted themselves, the court defaulted to morality. That meant, if she looked guilty, acted nervous, or failed to produce a convincing excuse, she could still be convicted. There's even a recorded phrase judges used. The shame was written on her face, which, last we checked, isn't a real form of forensic analysis. You lie there now, understanding something deeper. The Lex Julia wasn't built to discover truth. It was built to stage it, to act it out in a city obsessed with reputation, scandal, and control. Because in Rome, guilt wasn't something you proved, it was something you performed. You've been following the breadcrumbs, tiptoeing through candlelit atriums and marble courtrooms, but now it hits you. The double standard wasn't just cruel, it was structural. Because here's the bitter truth: Roman men could cheat. Roman women could die. Adultery laws under Augustus, they weren't symmetrical. They weren't even pretending to be. The Lex Julia was aimed almost exclusively at married women. Husbands were punished only if they violated another man's household by sleeping with someone else's wife or daughter. Otherwise, they had the legal equivalent of a hall pass. Let's make that real. You're a Roman citizen? You're married. You're also bored. You sneak off one afternoon to visit a local lupanar, a brothel carved into a back alley of Pompeii. Inside, you pay for the company of a freed woman, or a slave, or a profesional cortesan. You leave, adjusting your toga and humming a tavern tune. You've broken no law. Now picture your wife doing the same thing. She steps into a private house. She kisses a man, doesn't even sleep with him. Gets caught. She's exiled. Or worse. Historians still argue whether Augustus truly believed men's extramarital freedom was biologically inevitable or merely socially convenient. But legally, the message was crystal clear. Men's bodies were their own. Women's bodies were everyone's business. Here's your quirky tidbit. One Roman senator once tried to prosecute his neighbor for adultery, only to have the case thrown out because the woman in question was a slave. The judge responded, "One cannot adulterate what one does not own," which is the kind of sentence that makes your soul cramp. And it wasn't just about legality, it was about image. Roman men could brag about conquests. Julius Caesar himself was famously mocked, but never punished for seducing other men's wives. In fact, a popular chant among soldiers was, "Caesar may be bald, but he lays them all." A woman, one affair, even a rumored one, could end her social life forever. Let's take a hypothetical couple, Lucia and Marcus. Marcus is a mid-tier noble with a fondness for poets and parties. He's known to have mistresses, some respectable, some paid. Lucia suspects it, hears the whispers, but she says nothing, because if she complains, she is shamed for not keeping his interest. Lucia, meanwhile, write poetry, has friends. One day, she's seen laughing too closely with a visiting scholar. Marcus files a claim. She's banished within a week. Marcus, comforted by friends and told he showed admirable restraint. That's the double standard in action. And it wasn't hidden. It was openly discussed, praised, and encoded into Roman identity. Because for Roman men, masculinity was built around control of households, of wives, of slaves, of the city itself. A man who couldn't control his wife, that wasn't just embarrassing, it was a failure of leadership. And the way to fix that failure, you didn't work through it. You didn't try therapy. You punished it. Legally, publicly, permanently. Now let's explore one more slice of this mess: widows and unmarried women. You'd think they'd be free. No husbands to offend, no vows to break. But Rome didn't quite see it that way. If a widow slept with a man before remarrying, even privately, she could still be accused of immorality. Technically not adultery, but close enough to get her barred from certain religious roles or blacklisted from elite marriages. One widow wrote to a magistrate begging for clemency, claiming she'd only lain beside him, but not under him. The reply: even the gods see what blankets hide. In contrast, a man could be widowed, remarry, and carry on multiple relationships between wives. As long as he didn't touch another man's wife, he was fine. This legal landscape wasn't just sexist, it was dangerous. Because it created a culture of fear. Women lived in constant risk of being watched, accused, or shamed. They were expected to be modest, invisible, and perfectly pure while still birthing heirs, entertaining guests, and managing households. No margin for error. And sometimes, women internalized this structure. You read letters from Roman matrons scolding younger women: keep your eyes lowered, even looking too long, invite suspicion. It wasn't solidarity, it was survival. And here's the haunting part for many Roman men. This system seemed normal, natural. Even adultery laws weren't seen as repression. They were seen as protection of public order. Letting women choose their lovers, that was chaos. That was civil war. That was the fall of the Republic, literally. According to some moralists, you shift again in bed. Heart a little heavier now. You see, adultery in Rome wasn't just about sex. It was about power. About who got to define what was right. And who got to pay the price when it went wrong. And the most dangerous thing a woman could do: choose. You've made it this far. Curled under your blanket? Maybe fingers tucked under your chin, but there's one more twist you didn't expect. What if she's a widow? Surely. Then, no, adultery law applies. No husband to betray. No vows to violate. And yet Rome had no mercy for widows either. The Lex Julia, despite being a law about adultery, had a habit of expanding its reach like creeping ivy. It wrapped around not just marriages, but morality itself. And to Rome, widows had a duty to remain, well, in mourning. Not just emotionally, but sexually. Let's get specific. If a woman's husband died, she entered a period of luctus mourning, typically lasting 10 months. During this time, she was forbidden from remarrying. The idea: ensure the next child she had would not be mistaken for the late husband's. No. That's somewhat logical. Bloodlines mattered. But the law didn't stop there. If a widow was seen with a new man before the mourning period ended, she wasn't just shamed. She could be prosecuted for immorality. Not adultery per se, but close enough to get her exiled or barred from remarrying at all. It was like moral probation with a death certificate. Historians still argue whether Augustus's aim here was to protect lineage or simply enforce a kind of performative grief. But in practice, it was brutal. Imagine this. Your husband dies. You're 21. You didn't love him. He was 45 and had chronic indigestion. But you followed every rule. You light the funeral incense. You wear the black stola. You don't attend feasts. You cry a little. Then one night, a kind neighbor brings food. You talk. You laugh. You maybe, just maybe, touch hands. If someone sees, that's enough. You're summoned. Accused of disrespecting the dead, and your reputation falls faster than a poorly secured statue of Mars. Here's your quirky tidbit. One widow, Flavia Petronilla, was convicted for emotional unchastity, not for having sex, but for exchanging verses with a younger man. The judge, quoting an old proverb, said, "Where poetry blossoms, shame follows." She was sent to a coastal village where she lived out her years raising goats. And, yes, there were goat jokes for decades. So what if she remarried too soon? Then the children of that second union could be declared illegitimate, not citizens, not inheritors, not even technically hers under Roman law. A woman's womb was a legal ledger. And if she wrote in the wrong column, her whole lineage went up in smoke. Some women tried to outmaneuver this. They waited the proper months, then remarried in secret, hoping to present the next child as post-mourning. One woman, Cornelia Secunda, was discovered and dragged into court because her second husband had ordered matching rings before the official mourning ended. The merchant snitched. The court ruled. Exile. And don't forget, the law didn't just punish widows for being too quick. It punished them for being too free. Because if a widow chose not to remarry, she was also viewed suspiciously. Why wouldn't she want another husband? Was she plotting something withholding her womb from the Republic? In fact, unmarried women over a certain age were taxed under Augustus's Lex Papia Poppaea, a companion law to the Lex Julia, aimed at encouraging marriage and childbirth. If you didn't marry and have children, you paid fines. That's right. Penalized for abstaining. Penalized for loving too soon. Penalized for not loving again. It's no wonder that many Roman women lived in a state of permanent moral no-win. Every choice was wrong. Every silence was suspicious. Every glance carried consequence. And while Rome praised matronly virtue in theory, in practice, they rarely allowed women space to define virtue for themselves. It had to be assigned by law, by husband, by father, by forum gossip. You roll slightly now, head resting on your arm, and you picture them women wrapped in dark veils, walking carefully down marble steps, eyes cast low, speaking little, not because they were demure, but because they knew the price of being seen. And sometimes, widows fought back. One built her mourning room into a miniature fortress, allowing no men to enter for the full 10 months, even sending letters by handmaidens, sealed with wax and crossed with thread. Another hired a troupe of actors to perform moral tales outside her door, to prove she was meditating on virtue. That one earned applause and a tax audit. Even when widows followed the law, they were expected to look sad. No bright tunics, no poetry, no laughter in public. A widow once burst into tears during a play and was praised as the model of Roman grief. What they didn't know, she was crying from a toothache. But truth didn't matter. Only the performance did. Because Roman society wasn't built on empathy. It was built on optics. And nowhere was that more obvious than in how they treated widows' women punished for loving again. Punished for not loving at all. Punished for simply existing beyond the men who once defined them. You're quiet now. Not because the story's over, but because it's far too familiar. And you wonder, how many women through history have survived by shrinking? You're lying still. But inside, something twists because the laws don't just target the guilty. Tonight, we ask, what if the lover was low-born? What if the man caught with a married woman wasn't a senator? Or a knight? Or even a citizen, but a freedman, or worse, a slave? The answer, his life was worth less than a whisper. Under the Lex Julia, the punishment for adultery didn't scale with the act. It scaled with the social rank of the offender. If the lover was noble, things got complicated. There were hearings, debates, sometimes even mercy. But if he was a freedman, a man once enslaved, now legally free, but still socially stained, then the outcome was brutally predictable. You see, Rome was obsessed with hierarchy. Everything had a rank bloodlines. Clothes, seats in the theater, and so did justice. Let's say a patrician father catches his daughter in bed with a freedman. The man stammers, tries to explain. The daughter cries. The father doesn't even flinch. He kills the freedman immediately. The court calls it justified and honorable. Now picture the same father catching her with a senator's son. He draws his blade, but hesitates. He knows the family. He knows the consequences. There will be letters, trials, political fallout. So he pauses. Maybe even forgives. Or arranges a marriage. Not because he's merciful, because the man was important. Historians still argue whether this class-based leniency was baked into the Lex Julia, or simply how the courts applied it. But records show over and over again, the lower the lover's rank, the faster his death was accepted. And here's your quirky tidbit in one court case. A man was caught with a noble woman and screamed, "I am a freedman," but her equal in love. The court laughed. He was executed. The phrase became a joke among street performers. So let's talk about freedmen. These were former slaves who had been granted their freedom often for loyalty or payment, but still owed duties to their former masters. They could marry, work, and even accumulate wealth. But they carried a lifelong social stink. And if they overstepped their place, Rome reminded them quickly. A freedman who seduced a citizen's daughter wasn't just seen as immoral, he was seen as ungrateful. His death was framed as justice and a public service. One senator even declared during a trial he repaid freedom with disgrace. What could be more Roman than his removal? And what if the lover was still a slave? Then he wasn't even a person under the law. He was property, and killing him didn't require legal justification. You didn't need to accuse. You didn't need a trial. You could kill him on the spot. Like swatting a fly. In one notorious case, a noblewoman's slave was suspected of sleeping with her. The father didn't catch them. He didn't have proof. But he didn't need it. He had the man beaten to death in the courtyard and reported the incident as routine discipline. The magistrate shrugged. You sit up a little now. Disturbed not just by the violence, but by its casualness. Rome didn't hide this. It didn't treat it as scandalous. It was a feature of the system. Because the Lex Julia wasn't just about morality. It was about protecting the social order. If the wrong people touched the right women, the hierarchy cracked. And for an empire built on control, that was the real crime. Let's say you're a slave in a wealthy household. You see the daughter every day. She's kind. She's lonely. One night she kisses you. It's reckless. Stupid. But you kiss her back. Now imagine the father finds out. There's no trial. No appeal. You're dragged to the atrium. The daughter screams. You're flogged. Then hanged in the garden. The household carries on. The daughter is quietly sent to a cousin's villa. Her name is spoken only in whispers. You're not spoken of at all. And the man who did the killing, he's praised for preserving honor. Here's another twist. If a noblewoman was raped by a slave, she could still be accused of failing to resist. Because Rome didn't always distinguish between force and consent, especially when the accused was low-born. If you were seen together and she didn't scream or fight, the court assumed guilt. There's a phrase in Roman legal texts, even a slave can corrupt a lineage. It wasn't about morality. It was about bloodlines. The idea that a non-citizen might father a child within a noble house was terrifying to the elite. It was seen as pollution, inheritance rot. So, the law came down hard. Swift. Without mercy. And if you're wondering, did women ever fall in love with slaves? Of course they did. Love doesn't care about law. But Rome did. And it made sure those stories ended in silence. Exile. Or death. You lie back again. Eyes open in the dark. You think of all the nameless men who died not for love, not even for lust, but simply for touching someone above their station. And you wonder, in a city of such grandeur, such philosophy, such poetry, how could a human life weigh less than a name? The candle's flicker draws shadows on the wall. But the darkness is nothing compared to the chilling reality. Slaves didn't just lack rights. They were invisible to the law when it came to adultery. Slaves were property. Not citizens. Not persons. And that meant their bodies. Their lives. And their fates were at the mercy of their masters, especially in matters of sex. If a slave was caught with a married woman, it was rarely recorded as adultery. It was usually dismissed as property damage or disobedience. The punishment, often death, either by flogging, strangling, or worse, the law didn't even recognize the possibility that a slave could consent or love. They were things to be used or discarded. Imagine you're a slave. Your master's daughter beckons. You follow. Maybe you love her. Maybe you fear her. Either way, the consequences of discovery are grave. But the law doesn't care. You aren't seen. In one documented case, a slave was accused by the master of corrupting his wife. The slave was tortured, confessed under pain, and executed. The wife, she was exiled. The law sided with property owners every time. But slaves could also be accused of adultery among themselves. This was seen as a crime against order, but not punished as harshly. Often, they were simply separated, sold off, or punished lightly. Now, a strange quirk? Some Roman owners encouraged sexual relations between slaves if it meant producing more slaves to work their fields. But if slaves sought intimacy with free citizens, or noble women, the punishment was swift and brutal. Historians still debate whether sexual exploitation of slaves was codified or simply tolerated. But what's clear is that the system made no effort to protect the slaves themselves. And the consequences went beyond individuals. Sexual relations between slaves and free people could cause political scandals. Elite families feared pollution of bloodlines, thus justifying harsh laws and brutal punishments. You can almost hear the whispers in the atrium. Keep your slaves under control. Let no slave's shadow cross a noble woman's threshold. And the law enforced that, not just with words, but with death. You lay back, feeling the cold weight of it all. In a city that built temples to virtue and justice, countless lives were erased by laws that only protected the powerful, and in the silence, you hear the unspoken truth. Some bodies never counted. The night deepens. But the story twists darker still. What happens when a father refuses to kill? When the man who holds legal power chooses mercy over blood? You might think that such a decision would be praised as noble. But in ancient Rome, it was dangerous. Because the law didn't just give fathers the right to kill adulterous lovers, it expected them to act. Not acting was seen as weakness. Failure. A stain on the family name. In some cases, fathers who refused to execute their legal vengeance were forced to bring formal charges within 60 days or face criminal accusations themselves. Imagine the pressure. You're a Roman paterfamilias. You come home. You find your daughter betrayed. But your heart hesitates. You try to reason. You think, maybe this is a mistake. Yet society doesn't give you time to doubt. Gossip swarms your estate. Relatives question your manhood. The neighborhood wonders if you're complicit. If you delay, you risk becoming the villain in your own story. There are recorded cases where fathers faced public ridicule, legal penalties, even loss of political status for neglecting their paternal duties. The Senate passed motions declaring that failure to defend family honor weakens Rome itself. Now here's your quirky tidbit. A father from Ostia famously sued his own son-in-law for failing to kill the lover, claiming the husband was too gentle to defend his family's virtue. The court ruled against the son-in-law, ordering him to pay fines for emasculation, and the daughter left caught between men too afraid to act and laws too rigid to forgive. Some fathers tried to navigate this by orchestrating other punishments. Public shaming, forced divorces, even banishments of the lover rather than death. These alternatives were viewed with suspicion, sometimes contempt. They were soft, but softness in Rome was dangerous. Because the appearance of weakness invited threats, rivals, enemies, and even family members ready to seize power. Honor was a shield. Without it, you were exposed. And fathers who refused to kill often faced family conflict. Some daughters pressured their fathers to show mercy. Others feared retribution if their fathers were too harsh. Historians still argue how common this mercy was. Some say it was rare. Given the rigid expectations, others suggest that behind closed doors, more fathers did hesitate, if only to spare their daughters. One inscription from a rural villa hints at a father who spared his daughter but punished the lover harshly, writing, "Better a broken heart than a broken house." Yet, even mercy was a calculated risk. The law made no exceptions for feelings or forgiveness. If you spared your daughter but failed to report the affair, you could be prosecuted as an accomplice. Your mercy became criminal neglect. You roll over now, feeling the loneliness of that choice. To kill or not to kill a question with no right answer. And you understand that in Rome. Mercy was a rebellion. You're starting to see the human cost of all this, not just the laws, but the tangled webs they spun, and nowhere is that cost clearer than in the family dramas they caused, especially among Rome's ruling class. Even Augustus, the man who wrote these laws, wasn't immune. His own daughter, Julia the Elder, became a tragic symbol of the law's cruelty. Julia was a woman of charm and intellect, married multiple times for political alliances, but her personal life was turbulent, filled with rumors of scandal and adultery. And in 2 BCE, Augustus exiled her under the very laws he championed. You see, the emperor's daughter was accused of multiple adulteries. Her lover was a senator. The scandal rocked Rome. And yet, despite his immense power, Augustus did not intervene to save her. He enforced the law with ruthless consistency. Historians still argue whether Augustus's exile of Julia was a political move to cement his moral authority or a genuine attempt at family discipline. Either way, it sent a message. No one, not even the emperor's daughter, was above the law. Julia spent her remaining years isolated on an island. Away from the pomp and power she was born into, her children were stigmatized. Her name was whispered with both pity and shame. And the legacy Julia's downfall became a cautionary tale not just of adultery, but of the law's reach. It reminded everyone that Augustus's morality was no joke. No exception, and no mercy. You lay back, imagining Julia alone in exile, thinking of the empire her father built and the cage he created for its women. Because in Rome, justice was absolute, and so was the price. In the glare of public outrage and imperial decree, punishment wasn't just about death or exile, it was about shaming, stripping away dignity to send a message. And in Rome, public shaming was a weapon as sharp as any sword. When a woman was caught or accused of adultery, her punishment often included a public parade through the city streets, a spectacle designed to humiliate. She might be forced to wear plain clothing, her hair undone, or even a shaming symbol sewn onto her tunic. The goal was clear: make an example. Make the public witness the fall of virtue. The moral lesson was meant to ripple through neighborhoods, forums, and Senate halls. The lover, too, faced public disgrace. He could be paraded naked or dragged behind a chariot through the city, exposed to jeers and insults. Historians still debate how common such processions were, but literary sources and graffiti from Pompeii confirm that public humiliation was real, often accompanied by crowds gathering to witness, and the psychological impact devastating. Imagine the fear, the shame, the isolation. Your name whispered in marketplaces, your family distancing themselves, your future prospects erased. There's even a term for it: infamia, a loss of legal and social standing so complete that you were effectively a non-person in the eyes of society. But public shaming wasn't just punishment, it was control. The spectacle reinforced social norms and hierarchies, reminding everyone who held power and who was vulnerable. You're quiet now. Imagining the crowds, the noise, the jeers, and you see how the law didn't just punish bodies, it punished spirits. And how sometimes that's the cruelest punishment of all. You're beginning to grasp how the adultery law wasn't just about individuals, it was a tool in the grand chessboard of Roman politics. Adultery accusations could be weaponized to silence enemies, destroy rivals, and reshape power structures. Imagine a senator, known for opposing Augustus's policies. A whisper starts, his wife is unfaithful. A lover seen sneaking in and out at odd hours. A disgruntled slave testifies. The accusation gains traction. Suddenly, the senator is distracted. His reputation sullied. His political alliances waver. He's forced into defense. His energies diverted from the Senate floor to the courtroom. And when the verdict falls, even if innocent, the damage is done. Historians still argue the extent to which Augustus and his circle used the Lex Julia for political ends, but evidence shows it was not uncommon for moral laws to serve as weapons of political expediency. There are accounts of rival families fabricating adultery claims to break marriages, alliances, and inheritances. One infamous example involves the powerful Claudian family, where adultery accusations were used to oust a political rival's ally, changing the balance of power in the Senate. This politicization of adultery law meant that justice was often secondary to strategy, and that turned private betrayal into public spectacle and political theater. You lie back, imagining the backroom deals, the whispered threats, the letters scrawled in secret, because in Rome, morality wasn't just personal, it was a game of power. And the stakes were always deadly. You're now stepping beyond the marble palaces and into the crowded, noisy neighborhoods of Rome, the urban poor who lived far from the grandeur of senators and emperors. Here, the Lex Julia's reach was murkier. Ils ont forcément pas chier. And its impact different. In the Subura, the bustling, labyrinthine district teeming with merchants, craftsmen, and slaves' laws about adultery were often ignored or bent. The poor had other priorities: survival, work, feeding families. Fathers might threaten vengeance, but lacked the power or resources to act. Husbands often turned a blind eye because reporting adultery risked social backlash or violent reprisals. Roman authorities rarely intervened in such domestic disputes, unless they sparked public disorder. And yet, rumors of adulterous affairs were rampant, shared over crowded markets, tavern tables, and street corners. Historians still debate how much the Lex Julia influenced the daily lives of Rome's lower classes. Some argue it was a law of the elite, meant more for political control than social order. Others see it as a tool of social stratification, reinforcing class boundaries by policing the bodies of the poor less strictly. But even if the law was less enforced, social consequences were harsh. Women caught cheating in poor neighborhoods risked ostracism, violence, and loss of livelihood. Men risked debt or punishment from the husband or family. And yet, the chaotic urban environment also offered some freedoms. Affairs could be concealed behind crowded streets, noisy market, and the anonymity of city life. This tension between law and reality created a complicated social web, a world where adultery was both taboo and common, punished harshly in theory, but often tolerated in practice. You're quiet now, picturing the crowded alleys, the calls of vendors, the scent of cooking fires, mixing with whispered secrets. Because in Rome, laws are only as strong as the hands that enforce them, and not all hands are equal. You're sensing now that beneath all these laws and punishments lies a deeper, more unsettling truth. Rome was obsessed with controlling female sexuality. This wasn't just about fidelity. It was about fear. fear that women's desires could unravel the fabric of society, Roman men believed that a woman who chose her own lovers was a threat, not just to her husband or father, but to the very order of Rome. A woman's body was the battlefield for honor, inheritance, and power. The Lex Julia was just one weapon in a broader arsenal designed to contain and regulate female sexuality. Even the famed Vestal Virgins, women dedicated to chastity and ritual purity, were watched with suspicion. If one was caught breaking her vow, she was buried alive. And the common woman, she faced social surveillance at every turn. Gossip was law. Reputation was currency. Historians still argue whether this obsession was unique to Rome or shared by other ancient societies, but the scale and legal codification in Rome were extraordinary. You imagine the whispered warnings mothers gave their daughters? Watch your steps. Lower your gaze. Guard your virtue. Because in Rome, to be a woman was to live under constant watch, and the cost of defiance, exile, shame, or death. You lay back, the weight of centuries settling around you, and realize that these laws weren't just about sex, they were about power, fear, and control. You've been tracing the threads of law, power, and fear. And now it's time to ask, was this really about morality? Historians still argue fiercely whether the Lex Julia was a sincere effort by Augustus to restore Rome's lost virtues, or whether it was a clever political tool, part social engineering, part propaganda. Some scholars say Augustus genuinely believed Rome was slipping into decadence after years of civil war, and that strict laws against adultery would rebuild family structures, encourage childbirth, and strengthen the empire. Others argue that the law was a smokescreen, a way to control elites, intimidate rivals, and enforce loyalty under the guise of moral reform. The truth might be somewhere in between. You think about the paradox: Augustus's own family was entangled in scandal, his daughter exiled, his wife wielding power behind the scenes, yet he pushed harsh laws on others. You picture him sitting in the Senate, cloaked in dignity, promoting laws that punished adultery while navigating his own family's betrayals. This debate is ongoing. Was it a moral crusade or a political strategy? And perhaps the greatest irony is that the law created more chaos than order. It led to secret affairs, false accusations, family betrayals, and endless public scandals. This turmoil made the very fabric of Roman elite society both fragile and volatile. With trust being a rare commodity amid suspicion and intrigue, you lie quietly, knowing the answer may never come. But the law's impact was real and lasting. You're beginning to feel the law's shadow stretching into the very fabric of daily life. Because the Lex Julia didn't just punish it, reshaped how Romans married, trusted, and lived together. Marriage in Rome was no longer just a private contract. It became a legal and moral battleground, fraught with suspicion and surveillance. Husbands and fathers kept watchful eyes. Letters were censored. Visitors scrutinized. Even friendly neighbors could be spies. This new reality bred anxiety. Couples lived under the threat that a single misstep could end in exile, scandal, or death. Trust was fragile. Love was dangerous. Roman literature of the time reflects this tension. Poets lamented lost freedoms. Lovers wrote secret poems. And philosophers debated the meaning of virtue in a world ruled by law. Historians still argue how deeply the law changed marriage. But it's clear it introduced fear into the home, turning it into a place of constant vigilance. Even the smallest gestures and unguarded glance, a private conversation, could be scrutinized for hidden meanings. The very intimacy between spouses was now shadowed by suspicion. Back. Imagining a Roman couple sharing a meal, glancing over shoulders, weighing every word. And you wonder, can love survive when the law watches so closely? You wonder, was there ever resistance? Did any women dare to defy these iron laws? The answer is yes, but mostly in subtle, clever, and sometimes absurd ways. Because outright rebellion meant exile, or worse, many found their power in secrecy, cunning, or in manipulating social expectations. Some women disguised their lovers as family guests or servants, sneaking them into the house under the cover of night. Others resorted to coded letters and hidden messages. One infamous case involved a wife sending love poems written in invisible ink made from fruit juices, an early form of espionage. If you will, historians still debate how widespread these acts were. But the evidence suggests a quiet war of wills. Women turned their homes into fortresses of secrets. While men tried to pierce those defenses, you imagine a dimly lit Roman chamber? A woman whispering forbidden words, her heart pounding not just with passion, but with fear and strategy. In some circles, women formed alliances to protect each other, sharing information and warnings about suspicious husbands or nosy neighbors. These networks, though never officially recognized, were vital for survival in a city obsessed with virtue and reputation, and sometimes humor became a shield. Roman graffiti in Pompeii mockingly depicted adulterous women and their hapless lovers, hinting at public cynicism beneath the legal rigor. Back, thinking that in the shadow of law, resistance finds its own voice quiet, clever, and enduring. As you drift deeper into this tangled web, you realize that many of Rome's adultery laws drew inspiration from older Greek customs, ancient traditions that Rome adapted and sharpened to fit its own ambitions. In classical Athens, for instance, adultery was punished mainly by financial penalties and social exile rather than death. Women were expected to be modest, but the harsh blood penalties of Rome were rarer. Roman lawmakers took these older ideas and transformed them into something far more brutal and institutionalized. Augustus's reforms formalized control over personal behavior, weaving morality into the very fabric of the state. Historians still argue how much Greek law influenced Rome's harsher stance. Some see the Roman emphasis on paterfamilias power as uniquely severe, while others note similar themes in Hellenistic legal codes. You imagine a dusty library, ancient scrolls laid out, scholars debating how much Rome borrowed and how much it invented to secure its empire. This inheritance wasn't just legal, it was cultural, shaping ideas of honor, family, and gender roles for centuries. Back, sensing the long shadows cast by ancient laws, shadows that stretch far beyond Rome itself. The drama of adultery trials didn't just stay behind closed doors or dusty courtrooms, it often exploded into public spectacles. The ancient equivalent of today's reality, television. Citizens packed the forums and marketplaces to hear gossip, witness courtroom battles, and judge the fates of adulterers and their families. These trials were part legal proceeding, part social theater. Historians have uncovered accounts describing how crowds would gather hours before hearings, betting on outcomes, trading rumors, and shouting insults. One famous case involved a senator's wife, accused of infidelity. The trial lasted days, with witnesses called in and accusations flying. The public feast, satire, and poetry circulated widely afterward, immortalizing the scandal. Even graffiti from Pompeii reveals how deeply adultery and its trials captivated Roman public imagination. Witty, biting, sometimes crude commentaries etched onto walls for all to see. You imagine the murmur of the crowd, the excited whispers, the tension as verdicts were read aloud. For Rome, adultery trials weren't just about justice, they were about community, morality, and power. And the spectacle ensured that everyone knew the cost of betrayal was not just personal, but public. Time flows on, but the shadow of the Lex Julia persists, its influence outliving Augustus himself by centuries. Though the emperor who created it passed, the laws he enacted shaped Roman society and later legal systems far beyond his lifetime. As the empire evolved, Christian moral codes began to overlay Roman laws. The church embraced the harsh stance on adultery, often intensifying punishments and embedding the concepts into canon law. Even after Rome fell, these ancient ideas filtered through medieval legal systems, reinforcing patriarchal control over women's bodies and sexuality for generations. Historians still debate how much the Lex Julia directly influenced later European laws, but its legacy is undeniable. You think about the long arc of history, how one law, born of a specific time and place, cast ripples that reached far beyond its origin. You lean back, feeling the weight of centuries, and realize that some laws, like shadows, never fully disappear. The law you've been hearing about wasn't just cold ink on bronze, it affected real lives. Families torn apart by love, betrayal, and harsh justice. One recorded case tells of a young Roman woman whose secret affair was exposed by a jealous slave. Her father, heartbroken but duty-bound, confronted them. He chose mercy. He spared his daughter but killed her lover. The decision tore the family apart. The daughter, haunted by grief and guilt, withdrew from society. The father was shunned by peers for showing weakness. Stories like this echo through Roman history, showing the law's power to fracture as much as to order. You imagine the silence in that household, the tension behind closed doors, the long shadows cast by choices made in moments of passion. And you realize the Lex Julia was not just about punishment, it was about control, fear, and the fragile balance of family honor. As your eyes grow heavy, you begin to feel the weight of all you've learned, the power, the pain. The paradox is tangled in the Lex Julia. You see how a law meant to protect honor could also destroy it. How control bred fear and justice, sometimes disguised cruelty. And yet, through it all, life went on. Lovers met in secret. Families whispered. Women endured, resisted, and survived in ways both small and profound. You think about the faces behind the history, the daughters, fathers, husbands, and lovers caught in a web of law and loyalty. And as the night deepens, you find a strange comfort in knowing their stories live on not just in dusty scrolls, but in the quiet moments when history's echoes reach you. Now, dim the lights, breathe slowly, and let these tales fade gently into your dreams.